about JavaScript here this evening. And yeah, hopefully with some interesting slides. We're going to be talking about how to try and build apps that are a little less crazy, because I'm sure that many of us, our initial experience with JavaScript and mapping, if you come from kind of the same background I do, GIS, and you kind of got into programming through that, maybe your first experience with JavaScript started with something that looked like this, right? The illustrious ArcIMS viewer application. Fantastic stuff, right? You got it, you finally got it out working, and you connected all the dots, and you wrote some Axel, and you got your map showing up. And then, of course, somebody was like, this is really cool, except I want one other thing. And this is how we got into manipulating JavaScript, right? And so we had to look under the covers and try to peek around in the code, and your brain explodes, right? And you are fraught with peril because you're looking at this code, and this code just redefines spaghetti, right? Everything is cross-linked with everything else, and all awesomeness aside, I managed to dig this up today and then throw it into a gist so I can take a screen cap. But this little function here, write XML. This is exactly what you should never do with JavaScript, right? It's parsing XML as strings and going and sending it back to the server and posting and getting and all kinds of good stuff like that. So, this is all well and good. We go into the code and we're looking at it going like, oh man, my brain. And so then you go back to your boss and you're like, are you really sure that we need this feature? And he's all like, yep, we gotta do this. And then, so with this sort of a background, it's really not surprising that many people in the geo space have kind of this reaction when we talk about, hey, let's do some fun stuff with JavaScript, right? So, what I'm trying to do here tonight is tell you in graceful terms that times have changed, right? Things have gotten a lot better. We now have Douglas Crockford, who can expound upon the good way to write JavaScript. If you're not familiar with Douglas Crockford, he wrote a book called JavaScript: The Good Parts. And it's an O'Reilly Press book, and it's about a quarter-inch thick. And then you can get the O'Reilly authoritative book on JavaScript that's about 2 inches. And so if the good parts are 1/4, you kind of get his ideas on what you should use and what you shouldn't use. But it's an important thing, because if you follow his advice, you can build JavaScript that's a little bit better. We also have HTML5, right? Now we have a whole bunch of new and exciting things that we can do with the device and standardization about really high performance transforms, and we can do neat things in the user interface. And of course, every time you go to Starbucks, there's some scruffy-looking guy in the corner whipping up a startup based on MongoDB and some JavaScript and maybe a little Node. So what I'm trying to pitch out here is that maybe we need to turn our little JavaScript frowns upside down and figure out how to do some good stuff with this technology. Because lots of people are doing good things. It's just us in the mapping community that were kind of tainted by some prior experience that may not have been so optimal. Before I get into that, I wanted to hit a few JavaScript misconceptions. The first one, and this hopefully is not you, right? Because we're all developers, right? Because if you're not a developer and you're here tonight, you're probably on the worst date ever. So anybody who might have brought a date story like that. Really. First thing, JavaScript is not Java, right? Even though they share the same name, they don't really share the same name because they couldn't license the term JavaScript because Sun didn't want you to do it. Java is, of course, a compiled language that's statically typed, and it does all this stuff, and you have to compile it, and that's all well and good. And JavaScript is a dynamic thing. It doesn't use classes. It uses prototypes, and it runs in browsers, and you can run it on the server, but it's really just kind of running in a headless browser called V8. But we'll get into Node some other day. So that's thing one. It's mostly a thing you hear from management folks, but let's just try and kill that where we can. The next thing is that JavaScript is not jQuery. jQuery has done huge things to the JavaScript community because what it does, right, is it's gloss over the differences between browsers. The document object model, DOM, manipulation is different between different browsers. And what jQuery did that made the world a better place was allowed us to write one set of code that's going to work with weird IE situations, and it's going to work just as well in Chrome and in Firefox and Safari and in Opera, right? Fantastic stuff. The two are very different. Right? If you use jQuery all day long, that doesn't necessarily mean you know really much about JavaScript. It means you know how to manipulate jQuery to get stuff done, which is fantastic. It's a great starting point. But you should probably get Douglas Crockford's book as well, because it's going to help you learn a whole lot more about how JavaScript itself works. The next idea is that JavaScript is slow. Now, this was a big reason that a lot of people did stuff in Flex and in Silverlight. And it's a lot of reason why we did stuff in Flex and in Silverlight, but that's a whole other thing. But JavaScript being slow, I wanted to quickly shift over here. So I'm going to show you this, and just to kind of give you a background on it. This is something in D3, and this is the map of the world. It's the natural Earth data set. It's going to be brought down into the browser as JSON. So it's topologically correct JSON that gets brought down in the browser. Now, if this all works correctly, I will go over here, and this is fun, right? Facing the wrong direction, trying to run this. DevMeetup. Projection transition. So give this a second here to load. Okay, so this data is being reprojected on the fly in my browser, rendered to canvas. And it's cool, and it's going to just step through a whole bunch of crazy projections here. But what gets really cool, and you want to see that JavaScript is not slow, is when you start doing this, right? How many people remember having ArcGIS project something and waiting? And I'm running this in my browser with JSON that got downloaded, and I'm just flipping it around as fast and go. And this is a little MacBook Air, right? JavaScript is not slow. That's a non-issue. Let me just close this guy up. Switch back in. Hey, here we are. Okay, cool. But we do have some issues, right? It's not that JavaScript is slow. It is that certain implementations of JavaScript are slow. And down here on the bottom, you see Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8, which share the same logo. I don't know why that was. But terrible. Really bad. And when we have new browsers at the top, and we can include the little blue E up here, because IE9 and IE10, they have a new JavaScript engine. It's called Chakra. It's really fast. The difference is on the order of 10,000 times faster for some operations. So that little demo that I just showed using D3 says, you guys at the bottom, forget about it. We don't even deal with you. You get a, sorry, it's not going to work type of thing. But this is the important thing, right? 10,000 times faster. And you get organizations that are like, dude, you gotta use IE8, but I want the cool thing. It's like, just go use a better browser, okay? Get IE9, get IE10, you can do this. It's not JavaScript's fault. Anyways, the next thing, and really kind of the broader topic of what I want to touch on here, is JavaScript being messy, right? It has been messy in the past, and certainly we can still build messy things, and many people do. And it's not necessarily because of jQuery, but you can build very messy code by simply saying, I'm going to build an app, and I'm just going to go grab a bunch of jQuery mobile, and jQuery UI, and I'm going to blend it all together, and hands up, woo, I win! And we've done this. And so this is an app. It's for the Safe Routes to School people. It's great. It's called walkbiketoschool.org. And it allows people to create maps of how they go to school with their children, saying, okay, this is a safe route. In Old Town, Fort Collins, it's pretty much everywhere safe. But if you have to cross an interstate, it's important to know this is a good place to cross. This is a rich application. There's all kinds of interesting things. I'm not really interested in talking about that. What I am interested in talking about is that we built it kind of using the jQuery pattern. And so, in the code, and this may be a little bit hard to see here, but basically we have our document ready. And then we hook up all manner of click event handlers. We've got handlers on all kinds of stuff up in here. Different DOM elements get clicks, and these things do this and they do that. And all of those things then go and call out to functions. What do you think happens in those functions? Oh, we're going to connect more handlers. We're going to disconnect handlers. We're going to move stuff around here, and we're going to move it over there. All really well and good. And when we were writing this app, we understood how it worked. About a month later, we had a vague idea how it works. I actually have to go back into this app next week and try and figure out why one little corner case isn't working. And then, as I kind of approach that point next week, I hearken back to some words from Ward Cunningham, right? Ward Cunningham's the guy who invented the wiki. big thinking type dude. And he always said that you should code for the maintainer. And you should code for the maintainer, working on the assumption that the maintainer is a psychopath who knows where you live. Right? And so that's really my problem, is that I am now actually the psychopath. But I'm looking for myself. I helped create that application that I now have to go back into. So the whole point of all that is just really to set up for, okay, there's a better way to do things, right? And that really started with a framework called Backbone.js. And now we're going to speed things up a bit. So Backbone.js was invented by this classic overachiever, this dude, Jeremy Ashkenas, who was working at Document Cloud, which is all about open journalism. He invented CoffeeScript and now works for the New York Times Interactive Bureau. Interestingly, this guy and the guy who wrote D3.js that does all that crazy on-the-fly map projection stuff, Michael Bostock, he also works at the New York Times Interactive Division. So very curious that a lot of interesting things are coming out of there. But Jeremy was building Document Cloud, and as he was doing it, he started to find repetitive code in what he was doing, and he abstracted that out. And the library focuses on being just enough structure. It's a very unopinionated way of giving you things that are useful and things that are reusable without really imposing much upon you. And so the core elements of a backbone application start with this, a model. Right? A model is your entity, it's the thing you're going to manipulate. One of the ideas that we want to have when we're building software is we want clean separation between our data and our presentation of that data. As soon as those things two come together and get too muddled up, you end up kind of in that Jquery pattern. There's a lot of things you can do with Jquery. You can go and hide documents, object state inside of the DOM. You can go attach things all over the place. And that's workable, but it just gets complicated. So Backbone's idea was models are models, that's cool. They're the data. We have collections. Collections is a group of models, wow. But cool thing about it is they natively speak REST. So if you have a RESTful backing endpoint and you can pass it a URL and it understands get, put, post, delete, your entire CRUD layer of your application is done because you're using collection. You just tell it, hey, this is your URL. Go get, put, post, delete. Anything I create or update or edit, and then go fetch it from there. So really powerful. And then, of course, we actually have the view, right? So this is how am I going to show it on the screen. We need to orchestrate things. We want to keep things cleanly separated, so we use events. Events tie everything together. X can listen to Y, Y can listen to Z, everything bounces around. That's cool. And that's really what Backbone gives you. Now, you still have to write a whole bunch of code that sits around this thing. Right, you write your application. But using just these three, kind of four primitives, there's another one I'll talk about later that doesn't really play too much into this, called a router. But you can build incredible applications, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of companies that are building their apps based on this framework. And the reuse of it gives you a lot of flexibility in how you design your app, but a very consistent pattern in terms of how you're going to handle the models, how are you going to handle the database access, and then how are you going to handle the rendering. So that's really cool. When you step back and start thinking about, okay, this is neat, now I have all these things, and you just start thinking about how to compose them together. And so Mike Juniper, our kind of Zen level developer on Backbone, came up with this as kind of a guiding philosophy when we look at stuff, right? Your view is going to react to events on models or collections of models. And so that's a really handy thing to think about, okay, what I really want is I'm going to use code, I'm going to manipulate data, and I want the interface to automatically update, which is the whole core idea of this thing. Modify the data, have the UI update. Cool. So when we start to think about designing an application, wireframe it out, we say, okay, that's cool. That's basically what the client wants. Now we have to divide it out into our views, right? So we have a map view. That's fairly obvious. It's going to show us the map. And then in this one, I'm not going to go into the whole details here, but on the right-hand side, you have a fairly complex UI. And that is going to be the criteria, which is going to control what gets shown in the map. So basically a glorified querying interface. So we design it, and then we divide it up. Now, once we've divided our stuff up, we need to figure out, well, how are we going to get this component to render itself into our into the DOM, right? And so the way we do that is with templates. Now, how many people use JavaScript templating here? Okay, so for the rest of us, we'll go over this. The idea of templating is very similar to what you do with any web platform, right? You take data, you shove it into a template, and out come angle brackets. Except, instead of doing it on a server, we're going to do it on a client. So let's take some simple markup, right? We have an unordered list, we give it an ID. Fantastic. We're going to inject things into this. We're going to, somewhere on our page, have a little script block. And instead of being text, type being, JavaScript, script, or whatever, we say text template, or really anything else. You just don't want it to be executed, so you just have to call it something else. Give it an ID, and then you put HTML inside it. So this is a little bit of trickery that we do kind of to work around the browser, but it allows us to go put a template into the page, doesn't get rendered, doesn't show up anywhere. And then we use some JavaScript. In this case, we're using underscore, which is one of the dependencies of Backbone. It comes with a templating engine, and we say underscore, create me a template, and use jQuery to go get the contents of this template up here. So basically it goes and renders that sucker out, and then we use a little more jQuery here and say, hey, list guy up there, go and make your HTML be the compiled output passing in an object. Cool. So that's kind of cryptic, I understand, it's a little quick if you haven't done it before, but what you end up with is, beer, and then the 550 shows up there. So it's not really that hard, right? Syntactic, it's a little there, but conceptually not overly complicated. This is a major part of how we build rich JavaScript applications today, is lean heavily on some templating. This is about the simplest template you can possibly do, but we'll get there. So now, we're going to look at some code. Backbone 101. And I hadn't really planned on having the whole microphone here, so this could be interesting. So I'm going to switch over, and then I'm going to turn around, and I'm going to drive the app. By looking the wrong way. So we're at the Rio, right? So what happens at the Rio is we drink. And so I wanted to make a little demo thing here. Backbone 101, show the drinks, so I have a little link here. Show the drinks, great. We have margaritas, Dos Equis, and Corona. And then when I click on them, you can see down here, thanks for the margarita, Jack, and thanks for the Dos Equis, Jack. Fantastic. So I want to run through the basic idea of this in Backbone, and then I'm going to show us how to do it in a little more elegant way. So we've got our markup up here. This is hard. Don't recommend this anyway. So we have some really simple markup. We have our little link, which is the show drinks guy, and I've got a handler down below. We have our menu list, which is where I'm going to inject the things into. And then I just have this little debugger guy down here, which is where this debug info that thanks to Jack shows up. More interestingly, we will look at the JavaScript. Hooray for JavaScript. So data, okay, JSON, that's pretty straightforward. We just make a little hash JSON, say this is what's going to go in down. We do a little bit with Backbone. Our models are very simple. You just say Backbone model extend, that's going to go pick up a whole bunch of goodness from Backbone. You don't have to write anything extra. Our collection, all we need to do with the collection is tell, hey collection, your type of object is going to be the model itself. And I'm going to switch this over there. Then we have to create some views. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. So our box over here on the right-hand side, it's got two views. It has the whole container itself, and then it has the individual row items. This first guy, menu view, he is the whole container. Really, the only important things there are we set EL, which tells it, hey, what DOM element am I going to go and inject this into? Then we call render. Render's job is to, anyone? Render the content into the page. So very straightforward. We loop over the collection. We create individual menu items, which are the rows in our thing, and we go and shove them into the DOM. The exact details of that we can skip. But and then so the individual one, this goes somewhere. Trust me. So we get all this stuff, and we write a ton of code, and we set up the template, which says, hey, there's a template up here, right? Exactly like we just looked at in the slides. Go ahead and render that. But the important part here is we can register events on the stuff that we're injecting. So those individual views can have events tied to them. This is very, very handy. And more important than that, we get the model on the click event. So it's kind of down here. This stop model will get set inside of the event handler. This is a very huge thing. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal, right? Because you could write the same code much simpler You don't have to write all this extra stuff. But the click event over here, the only other way that you can do this is if you stuff a whole bunch of attributes onto the DOM elements that are in here in order to go and get, this feedback. When I click on those IPs, it knows that it's the those IPs. So that's an important part. So you get kind of all this stuff that comes together by using the collections and the models and the views, and the whole thing kind of comes together really relatively straightforward, I think. So let's shift back to this and make sure. And so you can say, Dave, wow, that was a lot of extra code for doing something that legitimately, if you just used underscore by itself, you could probably do in 4 lines, right? But it's more about the pattern, right? I can't show a super detailed case and expect anyone to follow any of it. This was pretty fast, even as it was. So let's talk about something a little more complicated. This is an application we built for Colorado DOT. It is their highway traffic count stations. So lots of data coming in here. We have that section over on the right-hand side that I talked about. This is the criteria. Which stations do I want to show? There's about 40 different controls, and amongst all these little flyouts, and there's a pop-up menu that does that as well. We show the results as clustered points up here. These are server-side clustered points. Those clustered points also represent the, at this point, 14,000 different stations that we have in Colorado DOT. But of course, this list down here only shows 10 of them, and they're all bound over to this side. So let's talk about how we build this at a conceptual level, because this gets a little more interesting. So we have our app. Obviously, we have a map, and its job is to be a view. Okay, simple. The more interesting thing here is that those clustered points, they're also a view in the backbone context, but they're a little different. We'll get to that in a second. This view has a collection. This collection listens to the change event on the object, the model that backs this whole thing. What's really cool about this, as soon as I make any change over here, and this is maybe not the best UI for this because there's ones that have sliders. As soon as I slide that change event fires. That change event fires tells this collection, hey collection, you need to go update yourself. So the collection goes and updates itself, and what happens is it renders the points into the map. So instead of taking that render function and dropping it to a template to go and inject DOM nodes into the, into a list, which is exactly what we do down below here, for the list view, right? We have a collection, it listens to the same thing, and it renders rows into a table. Instead of doing that, we simply go and inject things into the map. So hopefully that kind of shows that you can build a little bit more complicated stuff, and obviously I don't want to kind of show you the source code for that because it's thousands of lines of complex code. So that's cool. All right, backbone. Very good, very handy. We still have this concept that there's a lot of gray matter in here, right? We've had a lot of leeway with how we built this application. Now, Mike Juniper is a really smart guy, and he does a good job of separating his concerns and building the app in a sensible way. And if I was to hand this off to Jeff or myself and go in here, we go, okay, I got models, I got collections, I got views, I got events. I have a pretty good idea what's going on. But there's still all this gray matter, right? Different people are going to skin that cat differently. And so this is where Marionette comes in. Because Marionette was invented by Derek Bailey. He's a consultant and now works for Kendo UI. He's an evangelist for them. But he built Marionette on top of Backbone because he saw himself repeating patterns a lot and wanted to make sure that when he built an app and handed it over to his clients, that they would be able to maintain it because it was organized in such a way that there was no ambiguity about how it was going to be designed. And so what we have with that is we have the same 3 starting animals, our model, view, and collections, because we build on Backbone. So it's the same deal. But we add things, right? We have more specialized views. So composite views, extremely handy because they handle parent-child relationships. If you've ever had to render a tree view, this is your guy. As long as you can hand it a nested set of JSON, this thing can render it out for you. So it makes it super easy to deal with that. Another thing that you deal with a ton, and actually is something we just saw in that JS fiddle that I showed, where we had a collection that needs to be rendered. We do the same thing. What do we do in the collection type view? We iterate over it. We go and call another view, create instances, and shove them into a list, and then shove that in a DOM. So very straightforward. Why don't we just simplify it? So he created that as well. We also have modules, which is a good way to share code amongst different areas of your app. We have the concept of a controller. Something needs to orchestrate all these things. If you build a component that
you may want to reuse, wouldn't it be good if all the logic around it was packaged up in one central place? We also have the eventing and the router. These are the same two pieces that we get with normal Backbone. The router is just a way of managing the history, API in the browser, so your back button takes you to a previous state in the app, even though it's all JavaScript running. Very handy for being able to do deep linking into applications, as well as just supporting a back button so you can step back to a previous state. The other two things it adds that are really handy that Backbone doesn't natively give you are regions and layouts. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit more. But we also have the construct of an app itself. So the whole thing gets all bound up, and what you end up with in your actual page is app.start. Right? In that HTML page, app.start, and optionally a JSON hash of configuration. So you don't have a lot of goop in the actual HTML markup page. We have good clean separation. So that's going pretty good. And Jim's telling me I gotta read up. So we got regions. I want to go over regions real quick. So regions are this idea that, if we do it normally, we have a div on the screen, we're going to inject things into it. What do we got? Okay, we've got our div elements, and then we have event handlers. Cool. What if I want to reuse that section of screen? Well, if I go and say, hey, guys, go away, what happens? Those event handlers hang around. There's zombies, and zombies eat brains, and in your browser, the brains are the memory. You get severe memory leaks. If you're building a simple application, who cares? If you're building apps that you want to be running on someone's desktop for 8 hours a day, this becomes a really big deal. Now, what happens with a region is you do pretty much the same thing. You have a div, and you call region.show, and it goes and takes the output of that view and shoves it in there. Cool, just exactly like we had before. But then you go and call region.show with some other view, and it does a lot of work for you. It goes ahead and kills the event handlers, puts the new content in, and rehooks up any new event handlers on them. This is a huge benefit of moving things forward. Layouts take the same idea, but allow you to build kind of more complex views, so you can have regions within the templates. This is an incredibly powerful thing. You can have these things nested as deep as you want, but it definitely facilitates building really good apps. So, Marionette 101 and a layer switcher. So let's swip over here. So I'm basically going to show the same application. I'll show you that it works. Is anybody familiar with JS Fiddle? This is an incredibly powerful tool for hacking away at things, pulling libraries together, and then sharing it. So all of these, I'm going to write a blog post tomorrow. I'm recording this, so there'll be a screencast that goes with it, and then all the links to the fiddles will be in there. But it allows you to go here, basically go muck with stuff, play with it, without having to write a whole bunch of code. So that's pretty handy. So let's look at what's different. The only things that are really different here is instead of the UL, I have a div I'm going to inject things into. Down here, the models are all the same. This is all the code that I used to have. I took that out. The individual item view is pretty much the same. It's a little simpler. We don't have to do much with the templates because it assumes you're using underscore. So you just tell it the name. You don't have to go compile it and set it up. Then a little bit lower, we take out all this code that has the looping over it part. That goes away because we just use a collection view. And all we do is say, oh, the type of thing I'm going to put in here is an unview, and then I'm going to put it into a UL tag. Boom, done. So that's pretty cool. The actual region stuff itself is very simple. You just create a region, tell it its element on the page, go and shove things in. So I'll let you explore this stuff directly. So I want to look at this one. This is a little bit more GIS-y. The idea here is to create a double list. And so we have a list of layers that, of course, you can turn on multiples, and then you have base maps of which you can only turn on one. So, and when we click on these, we'll get some events to fire. That should show up. Okay, cool. So that's how that part works. This is really about exploring how layouts work. So I have in the markup here, our template is only slightly different. It's got the little layer list header part, but it has these two divs inside of it that are going to become regions that we're going to inject things into. So that's cool. We'll look down here, take a look at it. We have our base maps, 2 hashes. Everything's going to use the same models because they don't need to be any different. The application gets set up. This is a good example of how to build kind of a more traditional Marionette app. So we go through that, and then we just tell it, oh, hey, layout, you've got 2 regions, and we go and tell the things, create some collection views and item views, one for each set of things we're going to render, because one needs to be rendered with checkboxes, the other one with option boxes. So then we just go and set it all up. Using this, create some collections, go toss them over to the views, go and tell those views to lay themselves out, and call region.show. So, again, right, extremely high speed attempt to show something that's not all that simple to draw. So, maybe you'd like to take it a little slower than the high speed 30-minute intro that I just did right here. So, the main thing I want you to take away from this, right, is the idea that you can use backbone or marionette to give you patterns of reuse, right? Your apps have a consistent pattern, so when you need to look at a different app, you know basically what you're getting into. Otherwise, JavaScript, you just look at some crazy jQuery stuff and you're like, dude, I don't know. Start clicking things, start following through the code. But if you do use a framework like this, it's much easier.